Hey, River Church, it's Tim. I've got the first in our series in Philippians ready to go. I do want to quickly take a second and say it's really important that if we're going to be doing this together as a church and as a family group, it is important that we're taking the time to individually work through the passage. So last week I spoke on a process that's really important in understanding Scripture for yourself. It gives you the tools to be able to understand, okay, what is being said here? What does this mean forever? What did God mean with this? And then, what does this mean for me? This process is really important, so I really encourage you, take the time, if you haven't already. It's 11 verses. We're going to be in Philippians 1 to 11, and go ahead and read through that. Again, the steps are going to be, first, to understand what the author intended for the original audience. 2, examine differences in culture between the present and the biblical audiences. 3, what is the theological principle in this text? And 4, how should this be applied to our lives? So step 1 is understand what it meant then. Step 2 is understand the difference between what it meant then and what it means now. And that way you can understand, what did it always mean? What did God mean that can always be applicable? And then 4th, what does that mean for our context? So go ahead and take some time to do that. And once you come back, we're going to dive in. So now I do plan on helping out with steps 1 and 2 for this passage. Again, hopefully you've taken the time to do it yourself. If you haven't, we've got a couple of details I'd like to dive in on. Just as far as background, this is an introduction, an occasion for Paul's letter to the church in Philippi. At the time of writing, Paul is in prison in Rome. He has Timothy with him, not imprisoned, but likely as a penman, someone who's writing on his behalf. There's another man, and we're going to talk about him a little bit later, but there's a couple of characters that we need to introduce in order to give a little bit of a richer background. Paul clearly loves Philippi. To understand why, we can look at the rest of Scripture. So the question is, why Philippi? The number of epistles, certainly there's quite a few of them in the New Testament, but if you really take a step back and look at Paul's missionary journeys, there should be far more churches. And so why is Philippi one of those churches that gets to have an epistle written to them? Such a significant letter. And why does it start with such affection? To answer this, we want to go to the book of Acts. Acts is immediately following the events of the Gospels, which we just summarized in the Sunday series. And then it builds into the start of the church. The beauty of the book of Acts is it never ends. Chapter 28 happens, things are happening, there's no finish, because the church hasn't stopped. The church started, it grew, and it's continuing now. So, where we're going to look is during one of Paul's journeys. The book of Acts takes time to look at what Paul was doing. He was on a journey with Silas, and had recently taken Timothy in as part of that journey. And so the three of them had reached Philippi. So we're going to be in Acts 16, 11 to 15. And this gives us the background on the book of Philippians. So it says, starting in verse 11, it says, So setting sail from Troas, we made a direct voyage to Samothrace, and the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is the leading city in the district of Macedonia, and a Roman colony, which we'll break down in a second. We remained in this city some days, and on the Sabbath day we went outside the gate to the riverside, where we were supposed to be a place of prayer. We sat down and spoke with the women who had come together. One who heard us was a woman named Lydia. This will be the second character we want to spend time on. She's from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods, who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul, and after she was baptized, and her household as well, she urged us, saying, If you've judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. And she prevailed upon us. A series of events follow after this, but what's significant is understanding that this was the moment where the church in Philippi began. So, for this, to back it up a little bit and talk about the character, the Philippi, the city. This was a leading city in the district of Macedonia. It was wealthy and affluent. Also, to nuance it a little bit, it was, while wealthy, it was artisanal. There was a lot of high-end trade going on and a lot of excellent craftsmen in the city. So for someone like Lydia, who is a seller of purple goods, she would have been one of these craftsmen. Now the other thing that's important is it says it was a Roman colony. This is significant because when the church had started, a lot of what Paul was doing was beginning with people who spoke the same language, people who understood God. Maybe they had the Jewish belief system, and so he'd often start in synagogues, places of prayer. Now, in this Roman colony, there was no such place. That's why we find him starting outside the city gates, where there was supposed to be a place of prayer, somewhere where the Jews would gather and pray together. And so what he found was essentially a woman's Bible study. Lydia, one of the members of this group who was gathered praying, was gracious enough to understand what they were doing in the city and then hear the gospel from them. And from that conversion, that group started the church in Philippi. So that leads us to this second character we must understand, Lydia. Huge person in this book because this was Paul's person of peace. Pastor Josh talks often about how church planters need a person of peace, someone who is in the city and is willing to bridge the gap. So Paul, coming from outside, met Lydia, who had a place in Philippi, but she also had a place in Thyatira. And so some of these details are really important. The first thing is, from the city of Thyatira, she was influential. She had multiple places of living, and this would be for trade. So Thyatira would have been located in an Asian area. She would have had to travel not far, but a ways to get to Philippi, and then the reason for that would be for trading goods. She was a seller of purple goods. Purple was a difficult color to come by, and it was reserved for the extraordinarily wealthy or the royal. And so we know that not only was she influential, she had a reach in her business in at least like Macedonia and Asia, but she also had a lot of wealth because her business was high-end luxury. The third thing is, it says she was a worshiper of God. Now this is key because while we know she wasn't, at the moment Paul met her, a Christian, a Bible-believing New Testament Christian, she was a Bible-believing Old Testament Jew. She understood God. She wanted to seek God's truth. So when Paul came with the news of what Jesus had done, she was receptive, and she was that person of peace. More importantly, she had been gathering with other women in the city. A lot of this would have been because there wasn't much of a male Jewish presence in the city. But people coming in, because it's a major metropolitan area, they were able to start gathering together. This small group grew into be a major church in the city of Philippi. These people are the recipients of this letter. So then, the third character that's going to be introduced, this is someone we're going to hear two different times throughout the book. His name's Epaphroditus. He was a brave soldier and brother to Paul, because what he did was the church had come together, they knew Paul was in prison, and they sent a love offering. This wasn't the first time they had sent one, but this was something where they'd given gifts that he did not necessarily need, but he certainly did enjoy. So let's talk about the first reference. If you can flip ahead to Philippians 2, 25 to 27, this is the first mention of Epaphroditus, and then in the second is going to be in chapter 4, and we won't read through that. It's a lengthy text. We'll spend a whole session on that. So it says in that passage, Philippians 2, 25 to 27, it says, I've thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need, for he has been longing for you all and has been distressed because you heard he was ill. Indeed, he was ill near to death, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I have sorrow upon sorrow. Later it talks in chapter 4, Paul talks about how he's found contentment with much and with little, and that while he didn't need the offering that they gave him, he certainly felt loved and respected through that. Now, Epaphroditus was the representative of the church at Philippi. He made the journey from Philippi to Rome. During this journey, at some point, we're not sure how or why, but he became so sick he nearly died for this journey. But he pressed on instead of returning to make sure that he was able to deliver the goods to Paul. Now, this is huge because what this tells us is about the relationship between the church and Paul. What they had done was extraordinary. What was above most other churches, and the reason being wasn't because Paul asked for it. It wasn't because Paul needed it. It was because they loved him and sent him a gift from that love. So, when we take these three key characters, the city, Philippi, the woman, Lydia, and then the servant, Epaphroditus, we can kind of get this understanding of the background so that when we read through the Philippians 1:1-11 text, that deep, intimate love that Paul seems to have for these people makes perfect sense. So that's, if you want to take a second, take a step back and read through the passage one more time. We won't do that in the video, but you can help understand first what the author intended, what Paul intended with his letter, but then also step 2, where we're examining the difference between the present culture and that past original audience culture, understanding that the cultural differences aren't all that significant, because what Paul's doing is being a loving shepherd. He's sending back a letter of love. There's going to be some encouragement. There's going to be some chastisement. But at the end of the day, this all starts with 11 verses on how much he loves his people. So this leads us to the question. If we're to take these 4 steps to understand what was said, and then to understand what God's saying forever, beyond the specific details of culture, there's a lot you can take from this passage, but one of the big ones is that the church, whether it's local, River Church, or the capital C universal church across the entire earth, it was, is, and always will be marked by sincere love for one another. It's a family. There's no way around it. That's how it was then, and that's how it should be now. So then, for application, this is where step 4 comes in. My family, my wife and I, have discussed what does this mean for us. I encourage you families watching this together, or parents are watching this alone, to have a discussion with your family, with your children. What does this mean for you? What does it look like in this context where Paul did not have the option to go and be with the church, to continue to be with the church? Now, we have the luxury of technology. I'm recording a video right now about this exact passage. The reality is that we're able to love each other even if we can't get together. And this season is difficult. There's no way around it. But the reality is it's also an opportunity. It gives us a chance to love each other at a distance. Now, that's a good application for us as River Church. But what is this application for you? How are you going to apply this? This is the question that I really challenge you with. And this is the only question I leave you with. So next week, we're going to be diving in a little bit further. We're going to start seeing some of the core themes of the book of Philippians. This is where it gets really rich. So this next week is going to build up to the 3rd week, where we see the thesis statement of the entire book, and it's heavy. So buckle up. I encourage you, if you've got the time, if you didn't this week, try next week. But we're going to be going through 6 verses. It's going to be Philippians 1:12-18 next week. And so take the time to work through the 4 steps. You don't need to know everything. You don't need to know all the background. What I've given you in these 3 characters, the city of Philippi, the woman, Lydia, and Epaphroditus the soldier, that these people should be quite a bit enough to understand the context. The rest of it is just Paul loves this church, and this church loves Paul. So take the time and work through the 4 steps in that passage, so when we start again next week, we can dive right in. And lastly, I'd like to leave you with memory verse. If this is something you enjoy, where you're memorizing bits of scripture, I included Philippians 1:6. It says, "And I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ." What's important in context, and you'll see it yourself, is that this passage, while it's beautiful that there's a continuing work of Christ in us, it isn't necessarily meant for an individual, but for the church. That God's work in the church is not done. until it is complete in the day of Christ. So River Church, I love you guys. I'm bummed we can't be together, but for right now, this is awesome. If you have any questions, feel free to text me. I don't know if you have my number, but it's 774-200-5279. I'd love to be able to talk. Have a great day.